Characteristics of false identity. After a brief introduction of what is false identity, how it is formed, and exists just as a mental concept, I will be going through a few major, important characteristics of it. Although false identity only exists as a mental concept, a person is under its influence as long as the person thinks this identity is real or exists as an independent entity. Since a person thinks this identity is real, its characteristics will exude through the person. What are these characteristics and why is it important to recognize them? Knowing the characteristics of it will allow us, firstly, to understand why false identity is the root of sufferings. Secondly, during the long dissolution process, this serves as an extremely helpful reminder that this false identity stays asleep and displays its characteristics or awakes when the conditions are right. This reminder keeps us alert and aware that during peaceful and happy times, when the conditions may not seem obvious for false identity to awake, when circumstances or events are going smoothly for us, we may easily fall into the trap in thinking that we have completely dissolved this false identity. With such importance, let's get to know the characteristics of false identity. Perceives each physical body or entity as separate individuals. Since false identity thinks itself as an independent entity, an entity separate from the components that gave rise to it, it exerts this separateness throughout our psyche. Hence, under this influence, a person perceives each entity as separate entities. Separate, not in the sense without physical boundaries, but as an entity that exists without causality, or independent from any elements. This results in concepts of I, me, you, we, them, others, and others that promote this separateness. Attachment and attachments. Why false identity is able to continuously exist as an independent entity. Because for it to exist, it relies on the components that form itself. This reliance becomes an attachment. In other words, the mental concept has to attach itself to the components in order to feed its own existence as an independent entity. Since it is in constant need for validating its existence as an independent entity, it continuously searches for things as attachments. These things can be both material and immaterial. So things like titles, statuses, fulfillment in relationships, the latest mobile phones and many more, that this false identity can use as attachments to seek existential validation. The following three characteristics are more of a build-up from the previous two. Though they are built up from previous, it does not mean that they are secondary. Rather, they form and fuel a cyclic relationship with one another. Collect and compare. Since false identity is in need for existential validation, it constantly acquires attachments to tell itself that I'm independent and I'm in control. Hence it is always in constant collection of things, and the usage of this collection is to compare with other entities. To further validate itself as an independent and unique entity, it pushes the person to either acquire more attachments, or change attachments when it no longer feels its own uniqueness. This push is tightly associated with its nature to compare. When it looks at another entity's collection and thinks they are better, it will either accumulate more and relatively better attachments, or change attachments so as to set itself apart from others. Negativity. Because of its reliance on the components and attachments, negativity naturally follows. This negativity takes the form of fear. Fear of losing its independence and uniqueness. Fear of losing the components and attachments because it feeds on them as an assurance of its existence. Fear of losing the grip, the control it assumes it has, and many more. Basically, living in fear-based consciousness. This fear-based consciousness does not manifest only as fear, afraid, scared, timidity, but also as anger, greed, jealousy, pride, and most if not all, kinds of behaviors that can be observed in unawakened states. Anger can arise out of fear of losing something important, fear of not being acknowledged, fear of not being respected. Jealousy and pride arises for the same reasons quite similar to anger, except that the physical and emotional responses are different. Greed arises out of fear of not being able to own something and fear of losing out. The above are just a few fear-based reasons, and it is for all of us, as individuals, to introspect these underlying fears and to share them, so that the multifaceted fears of the false identity can be seen with more clarity. If you have any to share, please leave your sharings in the comment section below. Craftiness, cunning or elusiveness. False identity itself is not actually elusive, but it has that characteristic in relation to the level of inner clarity and awareness an individual has. This is so because in the initial stages, it can be hard to distinguish between false identity and pure awareness. Each of us has been identifying with the false identity for so long, that anyone saying that that is false, that anyone saying to disengage from it, brings a sense of fear and insecurity. Even after knowing what false identity is, it takes a long time to know its characteristics and to know from moment to moment whether the current emotions and thoughts arise from false identity or from pure awareness. During this journey, it is then important to know that moments that are seemingly peaceful may not mean that false identity is completely dissolved, but may be asleep or not as active compared to when in anger. And false identity attaches itself to anything and everything to validate its existence, be it physical matters, spiritual matters, and even the process of dissolution. It seems paradoxical, but it is true that when an individual takes on the process of dissolution, the false identity can attach itself to the idea of dissolution, creating a false impression that one is going through the process when in fact, false identity is using it to elevate its importance. So after a long period of time, one can come to a realization that false identity has not dissolved but instead has been more solidified. Although everyone goes through this stage, it is better to be prepared so that one can be more aware and get out of there as fast as possible. In conclusion, the above 5 characteristics of false identity are the basic and important ones. There are certainly more characteristics, and more of them work in a subtle ways into our psyche. So it is important to know and recognize them, how they arise in us and under what conditions they arise. To have this wisdom gain will enable us to recognize false identity and know how to dissolve it. It certainly takes time to gain clarity on them, and the more we know about them, the better equipped we are on our way to dissolve false identity. I would like to hear from you, comments and/or questions regarding this topic. Please leave them in the comment section and I will read them, and if possible, I will try to share my perspectives and probably share them in the later posts. Thank you.